Greetings to those who have joined the room in the last couple of minutes. We hope you enjoyed the afternoon session and whatever lunch break you're able to manage. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Tom McDermott, the CERC Deputy Director and Chief Technology Officer from Stevens Institute of Technology. And Mr. McDermott will be presenting updates on CERC research task WRT-1001, Digital Engineering Measures. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Jordan. It's kind of good in this talk to follow Stacy Cummings because this is all about collecting data and trying to understand what the performance measure should be. There's a lot of opportunity, I think, to link the digital transformation that's going on across what DoD considers system engineering with the role of the ERIC and the need to do better data collection and analytics in this space. I'm going to talk about digital engineering metrics. This project was sponsored by Phil Zimmerman up at OSD around one of the cores of the digital engineering transformation. I led the task with my co-PI, Eileen Van Aken at Virginia Tech. Eileen is the chair of the Industrial and System Engineering School or department at Virginia Tech, and she's an expert in organizational performance measures, so she was great to have on this study. Also at Stevens, Nicole Hutchinson, Annie Yu, and then Megan Clifford and Neil Chen supported some of the work in here, and Alejandro Salado and Caitlin Henderson at Virginia Tech. If you didn't have a chance to listen to Caitlin's doctoral fellow symposium presentation on the research she did under this project, you should go listen to that. It was a great example. She was one of the award winners too for her presentation. So she did a lot of the heavy lifting on parts of this research that I'll go through with you. So just to talk about this program, the Department of Defense released the digital engineering strategy, and that digital engineering strategy is very transformational. And it's looking at across these 5 areas a very large shift in the way they do business in the space. And because of that, the Digital Engineering Working Group has been tracking what they call pain points. And so those pain points are sort of all of the services getting together and saying, you know, we need to follow this part of the strategy, but these are the barriers that are hurting us in the space. And one of those big pain points is, as we move through this transition, how do we justify the investment in terms of return on investment? What are the key measures of digital engineering transformation that allow us to show the people that are doing the investment how we're achieving the return in the space? So hang on just a second. Have a dog howling in the background. So as we went through this process, we used several different tools to evaluate this. And I'll talk through most of these. So at the bottom here, it was a survey we did. And Caitlin yesterday talked about this, but the big instrument that we used up front was this system engineering, model-based system engineering maturity benchmark survey. And we based that around this NCOSE model-based capabilities matrix, which sort of founds the framework for enterprise measurement in the space. And then we also use the Baldrige criteria for performance excellence. So if you're familiar with the Baldrige Quality Award, this is the measurement instrument that they use to help organizations build their quality and also to measure for the award. And those fed into a metrics framework. So where we are today and what you'll see is a big list of metrics that ought to be considered when you're doing your digital transformation. What you won't see is here's how to actually measure it yet, and we have a follow-on implementation to do that. So we've been able to identify and rank them, but we haven't. There's not a whole lot of experience in actually measuring things out in the community yet. So it's interesting kind of start to think about where we are with digital transformation, digital engineering transformation. If you follow the Gartner hype cycle from the start of this effort through the peak of inflated expectations down to the trough of disillusionment. I think most people would say that we're really moving up that slope of enlightenment where organizational adoption is starting to get pretty strong. And we need to understand what a productive organization is when they do this. And we don't really understand that yet. So how do we get to that plateau of productivity? And that's actually a kind of a broad set of factors. So as you've heard mentioned throughout here, there's a technical infrastructure that has to be built and has to mature over time. We have to shift engineering from just a model-based to more of a data-driven and model-based activity. So there's the authoritative source of truth data, which is where you pull your measurements from. And there's models and model management along with that. We have to look at maturity over time. So how do we evolve our capability maturity? And out of that process, we get performance metrics, which, oh, by the way, also has to address the competencies of the people and the culture that drives that in the space. And so there's always a set of competencies that build a culture of innovation in a transformation space. Great opportunity, though. So, you know, and Cozy and others did a lot of work on the System Engineering Leading Indicators Guide. And those system engineering leading indicators are very important, but they're also, a lot of them are difficult to measure because they require data to be captured outside of the normal process of doing things. When we go digital, the data is going to be resident in the authoritative source of truth. And so we have a great opportunity to be much more measurement driven with system engineering and describe its value a whole lot better when we get there. If you're not familiar with the DoD strategy, this slide is not mine. It is the DoD's, and it puts the DoD strategy in the framework of a strategic management system. And so the vision is to modernize how the department designs, develops, delivers, operates, and sustains systems. So it's not to do DE. It's actually to change the whole process. And the mission is to safely connect people, processes, data, and capabilities. So it's a typical digital transformation where the goal is actually to connect people across data, not necessarily to change any individual processes. And so this can be described as a set of processes, methods, tools that go through a set of ways or initiatives to feed an end. And the end are the 5 components of the digital engineering strategy. I won't read through all the development here, but the pain points that they're following are linked to these ways or initiatives in the space. And so there's a lot of focus on doing that. When we looked at getting to the digital transformation, we wanted to figure out a framing for those measurements and a categorization of those measurements. And this is some of the work that we did in conjunction with Kaylin's work in her background literature review, was to try and say, what are those categories? Because the 5 categories of the strategy weren't necessarily working for us that well. We needed to understand this from more the viewpoint of large-scale digital transformation. So we looked to 2 sources, and one of those would be general digital transformation activities, and the other would be actually agile software activities, or DevOps, which might be considered one of the leading successful transformations in the engineering space these days. And so out of digital transformation in any type of change, you kind of see things organized into 2 metrics categories. One of those is adoption. So how are we doing adopting the methods and processes, building the roles and skills, conducting training, leading the change through leadership support, etc. And the other one is user experience. So are the people actually using the digital tools because they're helping them? They're gaining an experience out of it. So both of those things are, you can call these 2 things common to any digital transformation in the space. And so we have to focus on those. 2 others are more common to the process of digital engineering and digital design in the space. And so one of those is quality. We have a whole lot of data on quality measures from software, and they're highly reusable, if you want to call it that, once we get into an authoritative source of truth data, because software measures are developed out of the code, which is the truth. Ours will be developed out of the models, which become the truth in that space. And so there's factors there. And then the purpose of this, if you hear everybody talk about it, is speed of relevance. So how do we get more velocity and agility out of the process by doing these kind of things, like automating in the space and reusing and improving our efficiencies. The last area is kind of unique to system engineering. So system engineering would be the only domain, I think, that would say one of our major measurement categories is how well are we transferring knowledge, because our job is to actually be multidisciplinary and to integrate those knowledge sets. And so you see things like better information, better communications, and information sharing as being really strong in this domain, stronger than something that would happen inside a single discipline in that space. So we had this framework, and we started looking at that framework and how do we start figuring out how to collect and then rank these metrics that might pout out of these frameworks based on a set of studies. So one of the ways to do this is to look at what are important for mature organizations. The NCOSE Model-Based Capabilities Matrix is a capability metrics matrix for model-based system engineering and digital engineering capabilities in the space. And it was developed by Joe Hale at NASA and Al Hoeb at Aerospace, and then peer-reviewed through NCOSE for a while, and then finally released as a document. So this is fairly new. There's not necessarily a lot of consultants that are online helping people get their digital transformation done because they're using this matrix yet, but it's quite informative when you think of enterprise transformation and what needs to be done. So in a discussion with NCOSE and the National Defense Industrial Association and others, we said it would be really nice if we could have a survey that would actually assess or benchmark people's capability maturity at this point in time. And we said, that's great, because we got to look at this anyway. So we use this to develop a survey. And this is the survey that went out. It ran from, I think, October 2019 to January 2020. And it looked across these 12 categories, which are derived from the capabilities matrix. And it asked people to rate their level of agreement with statements that were derived from the capabilities matrix. So my embassy strategy is documented at the enterprise level: strongly agree, strongly disagree. So we just used a 4-level Likert scale: strongly agree, disagree, and strongly disagree to evaluate that. So we got quantitative metrics to, I think, 27 of these 34 questions. And then the italics ones were text-based answers. And so we had the quantitative results, and then we were able to do text analysis of all these text-based results in order to derive some additional metrics and data in the space. And so that was the survey. Closed in January 2020. And you can download the survey if you go to this CERC website, which is part of the news section. The results of the survey are in. It has the results of the survey, the final report on that. It also has the report that came out of this study, the DE metrics, in both a long form and a summary form. So you can download all of these and look at all the data that we generated in this space. So I'm just going to touch on some of that data in here. So this is a roll-up of the quantitative scoring. So remember, in the survey, we asked people in these different areas to rank things in terms of strongly disagree, disagree, agree, or strongly agree in the space. And we devised the statements to reflect if they were operating at maturity level 4. So if they had been a mature organization, then they would strongly agree that they're meeting that statement. And that's the way the survey was designed. And the survey design was done by myself and Nicole Hutchinson with help from folks at NCOSI and NDIA. And then the survey instrument was actually designed by Annie Yu and her student Neil Chen at Stevens. And so this was kind of a team effort. And so then you can see the results here in each of those quantitative questions. So in general, there's disagreement to even strong disagreement in terms of the community's maturity today. And this is one of the reasons why we're struggling with metrics. We're still learning. We're still working our way up the slope of enlightenment in the space, from knowing how to do MBSE and digital engineering to being mature at it. You can see some areas which there was agreement in the space. And so like trusted the environments we use are secure and protect our IPs. That kind of surprised us because there was fairly strong agreement in the space, though the narratives were more worrisome. So not sure what to make of that in the end. But you can see a couple areas where there was mixed feelings. So in particular in the metrics, which was really what we were interested in, there was agreement that modeling provides measurable improvement, would be the last word in there. But there's actually strong disagreement that we have consistent metrics. And Caitlin echoed this in her presentation yesterday. So there's a strong perception that modeling provides measurable improvement, but there's not strong measurement that actually is trying to quantify that today. That's where we are. And, you know, the biggest fear for the community is that leadership will give up on this transformation because they aren't able to cite a quantitative improvement from it in the space. And so there's definitely a sort of a desperation for things that we can measure to prove that this is having benefit in the domain. And that's right in the middle of our study. Another area, for instance, there was agreement that the digital engineering support, that companies have support for model libraries for model reuse. So they have the libraries to reuse, but there was pretty strong disagreement that those libraries actually support discoverable knowledge and they're consistently used. And so we're building digital engineering infrastructure, but we're still discovering the processes to use it efficiently in that domain. So that's another kind of area in the space. So we'll go through some examples of these, but all the rest of them are in the depths of the report. A different perspective on this same data that was kind of interesting. So we were able to determine from the survey who in the survey were executive management, who in the survey were other levels of management, program and project level, and who in the survey were the technical folks, the system engineer and the other technical roles in the space. And so there was a disparity of answers or agreement across that space. So if we actually go through and look at executive management and program and other management, out of these 27 measures, they were positive or in agreement on 18 of the measures. If you go look across the engineering base doing the work, they were positive or in agreement on only 9 of the measures. And they were in strong disagreement on a number of measures where management was slightly in agreement, for instance. And so this was kind of strongly supporting the research that Caitlin was doing in parallel to us, that there's a lot of perceived benefit of model-based system engineering and digital engineering, but there's not a whole lot of measured benefit yet. And it was confirming that the perceived benefits were probably higher than the actual benefits that people were seeing at the working level in the space. And so we're not necessarily really mature down at the working process level, but there is actually strong benefit from up at the top, as perceived by top level management. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because it's causing executive management to put funding into digital engineering transformation because they do perceive the benefits from it. But there's a risk that they might be expecting more than the tools and processes and people can give them right now. And so we need to keep on this and work our way through it as we go forth. So, so this just summarizes the literature review that Caitlin did and presented in her PhD work yesterday. So she did a literature review that we kind of agreed to link together with this with our NCOSI and NDIA partners that would examine the literature that talked about benefits in the space. And so she read, thank goodness for her, 847 papers, found 360 that cited benefits of MBSE. And so as a result, and watch her presentation to go through the details of it, we were able to take her work between myself and Alejandro and Eileen and Caitlin, and we were able to derive 48 language aligned benefit categories for future analysis and link them to the survey data. And so we did a lot of work to organize those things together. And her work, as mentioned, supported this process that there's a strong agreement that it provides benefit, but very little measured data that actually shows the benefit. In fact, there's only 2 papers that cited measured gains, while 236 talked about perceived gains in that space. So we needed to drill down on that in the text-based results to the survey. So this is kind of the quantitative results, and this is most cited across the literature review in terms of the things that were of interest. So reduce errors and defects, highly perceived and actually measured in some cases. This is what you might expect when you get data into a digital form and you can link it to actual errors and defects that move from phase to phase in a program. Improved traceability. Highly perceived, only measured once, and it's not necessarily so clear how you measure traceability in that space. Same thing for reuse, same thing for collaboration and information sharing. Interesting with automation. So 2 citations of benefit, measure benefit from automation, mostly related to automated document generation, where no perception that that's going to be a benefit yet. Excuse me. So that kind of gives you an idea of the state of the world at this point in time. So this then takes all of that background information and links it to the survey data. And the blue here are the responses from the survey data, and the orange are the responses from the lit review. And you can peruse through all the details of all these 48 categories in the report. I can tell you that we were able to pull out really a top 7, although we listed a top 10 set of key metrics. And these would be classified as benefit metrics in that space. And so the idea here is now is if you were going to go try and design a measurement process, then you would probably want to focus on these 7 here, which were the most cited to this point in time. And so we've got this kind of categorization down. I'll also mention that we looked a lot about competencies in the space. And so we did find new competency sets. System engineering is the core. Digital engineering is digital system engineering, and they go together. But there's new digital data and tool competencies. And this was fed into another study, which you could see here at SSRR on the digital engineering competency framework in the space. And so I won't necessarily show that to you, but that competency framework is something that you ought to go take a look at, because it's actually identified a linkage across 22 competency sets focused on these 2 areas of tool expertise and digital skills in relationship to core system engineering skills. Another piece of research that came together with this process. And then the last area is the adoption measures. And we just got this out of survey data. We asked 3 questions. What are the obstacles to DE transformation? What are the enablers for it? And what changes do you see as being needed in the space? And so we were able, across those three questions, to derive a set of adoption metrics that would be most important. Leadership, support, and commitment being, of course, first in that space, but also willingness to use the tools as being a key leading indicator of change in that domain. And so we did in the report pick out the top 5 in this space that ought to be focused on across the adoption metric space. Just talking a little bit about next steps. The Baldrige CPE framework provided us with the basis for understanding those adoption measures. And so if you're not familiar with Baldrige, it kind of builds a measurement framework around the intersection between leadership strategy and your customer base as integrated with your workforce capabilities or operational capabilities and your measured results in the space. And so there's a lot of examples when we did this where we were able to link traditional things that would become out of the Baldrige Award for quality organizational characteristics to statements that would be reasons to adopt digital engineering and reasons why digital engineering can support the organization. There's more work to do here. I think there's probably an organizational framework, capacity framework that can be built, but was not part of this study. So hopefully somebody will take what Nkozi's done and take this work, and they'll build up a organizational capacity framework that will help us in the long term. I'll tell you that we did one test with the survey data. So we took the NAVAIR surrogate pilot program that Mark Blackburn has briefed here today, and we actually we applied the metrics to what they discovered to date in the NAVAIR pilot. And so what Mark was able to do was build this QFD that looked at things that they did in the organization and their strength of linkage to these top measures. And so you can see things like increased traceability, improved consistency, communications, information sharing, support for automation. These things are all showing up very strongly again in terms of rankings at different phases of the program. And so Mark has talked some more about this, but this was just the initial confirmation on one program that we had detailed access to into whether our rankings were making sense in the domain. So just a final slide here. We were able to go back and build a systemogram of sort of this leadership commitment at the end, linking it to measures. And so there's 3 things. Leadership must have a strong intent, strategic vector that provides investment and persists to transform our workforce and culture. Leadership must create buy-in with funded initiatives, invested in initiatives that allow the organization to grow their capacity. And there's certain metrics that are highly associated with those. And those are the key things that are going to cause people to be willing to use the tools in the space. And then leadership must provide messaging that's actually linked to metrics. So we want better informed requirements. We need to measure increase in traceability across our program sets. And so we're starting to see some of that come out in some of the programs. I know that this messaging, for instance, better informed requirements, increased traceability, is right in the center of the F-35 program's digital transformation planning space. So this led us in the report to a set of example metric definitions, which are the starting place for actually building a metrics model. And so this is just an example of that. I won't go through the details of that. It's pretty early. We were also in the report, we were able to take this particular type of definition and then link them back to the DoD pain points. And that's included as a table in the report also, at least the pain points as they were at that point in time. So just a final slide. I think I'm nearly out of time here. There is a follow-on. It hasn't started yet. We're waiting for the startup on this. that's actually going to be led by Alejandro Salado and Caitlin Henderson to work with select programs to build a measurement plan out of this work, to do it in a systemic fashion, looking at causal relationships, and then to work with the organization across the year to try and collect sample benefits and analyze the measurement results. And so we're actually looking for programs like this right now. If you are a program and you want to work with us over the next year, please contact me or Alejandro, because we'd love to find 2 or 3 programs where we can work together on this. And that is, I believe, the last slide. Any questions?
Great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. We do have a couple questions, and we have about 10 minutes remaining also for questions. So if you're in the audience and you've got something you'd like to ask, there's plenty of time to get it into the Q&A. So both of our questions are from Beth Wilson. Her first is, did the survey address disconnects between decision makers like SE functional managers or program managers and MBSE advocates? And for a little context, she says that she's seen decision makers thinking that just an hour of tool training would make MBSE happen, but conversely also seen MBSE advocates spook the horses by saying the ugly models could replace the documents that the managers actually knew how to read.
So Beth, that's actually, it's an interesting question. I would say that that the survey didn't show those disconnects in a quantitative way, in a way that we could derive from text analytics in the space, but I think we were able to pull anecdotes out of the survey data that would talk about just what you're talking about here in the space. And so I wouldn't call it a good sample size, but we were able to pull sets of anecdotes out, and I'd have to go back and look and see how they address the particular phenomenon that you're talking about here in that space. Ideally, we'd be able to do this survey again, and maybe a couple more times in the future, sort of every 1.5 to 2 years, to see how the community is evolving, and we maybe could build up some more representative data from the text-based analytics out of the survey data.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, has there been any research on the benefits, presumably of MBSE, to test and evaluation? And she says that she's advocated that system design sequence diagrams could become test procedures, but the test teams were then told that the models had not been maintained.
So so we were not able to find any in that space, and so the linkage between models as developed for upfront system definition and feeding into design, and then models that were developed for test, doesn't seem to be there today, and seem to be much in between them. You know, we found anecdotal evidence from the survey and others that investment in modeling up front does create return in the test activities. But I suspect that those were way more associated with integration and test within the program, using the same model set, not with anything like an operational test activity. We have had some discussions, and you know, if you saw the talk by Barry Horowitz earlier today and Cody Fleming, they talked about modeling the cybersecurity aspects specifically for T&E use in the domain. So I think right now we're really pretty immature in terms of trying to understand how the later stages of operational test and evaluation feed into the modeling environments.
Yeah, just if I could piggyback on that a second, I do know that in the spacecraft world, for example, it's common to use cases that are developed as part of more lower level requirements development for day in life testing, and then also testing, early testing once on orbit. So I have seen that kind of thing happen in that domain.
Yeah, it's just not necessarily the different organizations are using models in the same way right now.
So Peter has a question. He asks, did you include either AI for SE or SE for AI? as part of the MBSE discussion?
So not specifically. It was really interesting at the time that we did this literature review, which would say probably from mid 2019 backwards in terms of what Caitlin had looked at, that we found two papers that talked about measured benefits from automation, but we didn't find any papers that perceived or observed benefits from automation. So it was almost like it was falling out of the process in that space. I personally, as being also focused on the AI for SE domain, think that automation is going to be one of the primary benefits of model-based system engineering. And we've had we have a roadmap in the CERC to talk about that. I would say that the examples of research where they're using artificial intelligence and machine learning to either do model checking and model creation, or to do document generation or other things like that, the research in that domain is actually growing quite fast right now. So just in the past year and a half, we've seen that start to grow exponentially. So yeah, the question is maybe maybe we include it in the MBSE discussion, but I would say, if we did this survey in 2 years, I think you'd see automation as being a much higher benefit to come out of the process.
Stephanie has a question. Did you include, or is there a plan in the future with surveys that you've mentioned to get the benefit versus value from, sorry, my question's moved here, from those involved in decision making that are outside of this community? Often those are the decisions that then provide support for an environment for implementation. So that would be program management, business development type folks.
So I think there's a lot of effort to link digital engineering in with the program management activities and the enterprise development activities. And I actually think that that's what we're looking for. We're looking for those metrics that show the value of moving the engineering process to a digital environment as reflected in things that create value at the enterprise level in the space. And again, I think that it's actually quite looking at that. Now, I think specific to your question, Steph, we did this survey with the system engineering community. We discussed redoing the survey with the sponsor in some other communities that would be somewhat related. So like automotive, maybe SAE or somebody like that, as they're going through their digital transformations, to see if you got different perspectives from those communities. And we haven't had the opportunity to do that. We might be able to do that in the future. But that was one of the recommendations, is could we go broader with the survey and try and touch some other organizations and organizational components that are in digital transformation.
Thanks. So I think this will probably be our last question. Stephanie has another question. She notes that some of the identified or listed measures and benefits from the literature review are also qualities that companies may consider competition sensitive. They wouldn't want to reveal information related to that due to competition reasons. And so they wouldn't publish on those topics. So are there other options for collecting that data? And has that been thought about?
Well, I think that's our next phase, is to work with some of these organizations and, in a way where we can see that data. I'll tell you that the survey that we did, that the respondees are pretty open, which tells you, one, that they're not necessarily shy about sharing, and it was an anonymous survey, sharing in an anonymous fashion some of the things that they're seeing. But it also tells you that there's not much secret sauce to share yet that they would consider to be proprietary. So yeah, I think that's still evolving. But I think as we go forward, we can reassess via survey data, but we're also going to have to start talking to not only the companies that are doing this, but probably the consultancies that are standing up to help, which you don't see that many of them yet, and other organizations like that that are going to be more expertise. I will mention that we just started an activity between NCOSI, NDIA, and AIA, Aircraft Industries Association, that that we are going to support in our next phase, that is focused on standardizing these performance metrics. And so they're starting with the practical software measures guide, if you're familiar with that activity. We developed across those organizations, and then we're gonna work on standardizing on recommended measurement sets. So we're going to be working over the next year in conjunction with that group. If you're interested in that group, send me an email, and we can tell you how to get involved.
Great. Well, we're out of time. So thank you so much, Mr. McDermott, as well as those who participated in the Q&A and everyone who attended.